Okay, so today y'all are going to be taking some guided notes on the components of an ecosystem. Most of the stuff should be review. However, there are going to be some things that are going to be new. So just like any of the other guided notes, you will need to fill in all of the red and write down the red in your notes. When you're finished, I want you to trim them so that they will fit in your journal and glue them into your journal like pages after the food chain activity that we did yesterday in class. All right, so let's go over things that we have already learned. The components of an ecosystem are all living things and non living things and how they interact in a particular area. So, biotic. Biotic means living and all living factors. Examples include um, all plants, all animals, all fungi, all bacteria, all protists. Abiotic are non living things. They can include rocks, water, sunlight, shelter, temperature, climate, pretty much anything that anything a living thing has to have to survive, but it itself is not living. Now, everything has a particular niche in an ecosystem, and the definition of niche is a specific role in that ecosystem. One of our need to knows is what is the role or roles of the organisms, and so we're going to discuss that today. A role would be its particular niche. So, for example, you could have one tree, but many organisms could live in a particular niche or have a particular role for that tree, such as bacteria and earthworms could help with the roots. Insects and larvae could live in the trunk. Birds, bees, wasps could live in the branches or the leaves. Every ecosystem is made up of habitats that provide things a living organism needs. So, what do organisms need? We need food for nutrients and energy. We need space for shelter, water, and we also need the same species so that we can mate and reproduce to pass on our DNA. Organisms are going to compete with each other for these essential needs for survival. So, competition is a very big thing in an ecosystem. Plants compete for light for photosynthesis. For example, in the rainforest, when you have that very dense canopy, if a tree falls and light somehow makes it to the bottom, organisms will start to spring out of the soil and they will compete to see who is the first and the fastest growing to get that spot. Those who do not make it will die. They also compete for water, nutrients, and minerals. Animals can compete for food, water, mates to reproduce. You've probably seen it where males will fight to compete for a female. And they'll also fight for living space in their territory. So make sure you understand that all living things do compete for these essential things to survive. So let's talk about possible roles of an organism. So let's start with producer, and you're going to put this in the table. So write the red in the very top column and the examples in the bottom. So producers make their own energy through photosynthesis. They're also called autotrophs. So we call them producers because they do produce their own food. They make their own energy. Examples can include vegetables, trees, flowers, algae. Even some bacteria can do photosynthesis, like we talked about when we were going over the marine ecosystem. Consumers. Consumers must obtain their energy through eating other organisms. Because we are not able to do photosynthesis, we have to obtain our energy another way, and we do that by eating other organisms. So since we do not make our own energy, we are called consumers because we have to consume our food, or we're called heterotrophs because hetero means different and troph means to eat. So we can eat many different things. Examples could include herbivores, carnivores, omnivores, and some scavengers. And even in the picture, the Venus flytrap. And then the other main role are decomposers. Now, decomposers don't actually eat, that's why it's in parentheses, but they consume dead plants and animals to obtain energy by breaking them down and absorbing them. They return the raw materials to the environment, usually back into the soil for the plants to take up the minerals and nutrients again. The most common decomposers are fungi, which is all mushrooms and that kind of stuff, slime molds, mold, and bacteria. Notice how decomposers are not animals themselves. Okay, so let's go over some words to know. These are vocabulary words that you're going to need to know. An organism is an individual within a species. You are an organism. A dog is an organism. A cat is an organism. When you take a bunch of the same organisms and individuals and put them together, that is called a population. So you can have a population of humans, a population of deer, that kind of stuff. So now here's a review from 7th grade. Traits. A trait is a structural or behavioral that are genetically determined. You have green eyes, you have blonde hair, you have curly hair, you have a widow's peak in your hairline. These are all traits that were passed along to you from your parents, and so they determine your physical characteristics. Adaptation is another word that you definitely need to know. It is a trait that increases an organism's ability to survive in an environment. These are written in your genetic code, which is your DNA, and they are not a choice or a decision that the organism can make. You did not choose to have green eyes because they are in your traits. So an example of adaptation is that the fur that camouflages the background from a prey. So think of an Arctic hare, which is a rabbit. They obviously live in areas where it's really snowy, and so they turn white in the winter to help them blend in so that their predator, the fox, can't sneak up on them. Also, an example could be a predator could blend into the background or have very fast muscles to allow for speed, like a cheetah. If your prey is moving really fast, only the fastest of the predators are going to be able to catch it. So over time, the animals that have a particular trait that is favored are going to survive and therefore be able to reproduce and pass off their DNA. Over time, the population is going to change, which is called adaptation. Natural selection is a process where organisms with adaptations to a particular environment survive and reproduce, increasing the frequency of that adaptation in a population. So let's look at a picture on the right. You have some beetles. You have orange beetles and green beetles. Well, let's pretend that the birds particularly like to eat the green ones for some reason. Maybe they stick out in their environment. So the green ones are going to get eaten. Well, the more likely you are to get eaten, the less likely you're going to be able to survive and reproduce. Generations later, notice how there's a lot more orange. Again, the green are favorite, and eventually this species can be adapted through natural selection to where all the beetles now are going to be orange. Now, what happens if all of a sudden the birds decide that they like to eat the orange? It can revert back, but adaptation happens over a very, very long period of time. It's not like you can pass it down from a mother to an offspring. It is going to take 50, 100, thousands, millions of years. Okay, so let's talk about how species interact. They can interact in 3 ways, and you definitely need to know these 3. Competition, which we kind of already talked about, symbiosis, and predator and prey. Symbiosis is only pretty much going to be the new one for us to discuss. So let's talk about competition. Competition is when 2 organisms live in the same niche, which means they have the same role, and there's limited resources. So you fight for that survival. So birds could fight to live in the same area of the tree. They could fight for food or shelter or mates. Anytime 2 organisms are going to be competing for something, for a limited resource, that is called competition. So what adaptations do you think birds would have to be able to survive in this tree? If all these birds need to survive in the same tree, they're going to have a different food source. They might have different types of beaks for the different types of food that they eat. And they might have different calls for communication. Okay, so let's go into symbiosis. There are 3 types of symbiosis: mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. The definition of symbiosis is a long-term interaction or relationship between species. So it's not talking about competition or predator-prey, but it is going to show how two organisms are going to have some type of relationship with each other. So mutualism. Mutualism is when both species benefit from the relationship. So notice how we have two smiley faces and a positive positive. When both of them benefit, it's mutual. So we call that mutualism. Commensalism is when one organism benefits from the relationship, but the other one is not affected. They are not helped, but they're not harmed either. So we're going to give them a 0, kind of like neutral. And then the last one is parasitism. We'll think about what that word sounds like. Kind of sounds like a parasite. And we know that parasites tend to be bad for us. So parasitism is when one organism benefits and the other one is harmed in some way. So let's think of some examples of mutualism. It could be like a clownfish living in a sea anemone. Think of Finding Nemo, where his dad tells him, you better brush your teeth on the clownfish or he's going to sting you. Clownfish actually help to keep the sea anemone clean by eating tiny little food particles off of it, so the sea anemone benefits. In return, he provides a home or shelter for the clownfish and will sting any other fish that tries to get near it. So both of them benefit, so that's mutualism. Another example could be like a cowbird. Have you ever driven past a pasture and seen all these little white birds around cows? Well, these cowbirds will actually eat ticks and parasites off of the cow. The benefit for the cow is it gets parasites removed off of them. The benefit for the bird is it gets something to eat. Kind of like a bird that will clean an alligator's teeth or an aurora fish that will follow a shark around eating the scraps. Now, an example of commensalism could be a barnacle on a whale. Because whales are slow moving, a barnacle can attach to them, which is actually an animal that lives in a shell. And as the barnacle travels around with the whale, it's allowed to take its tentacles out and filter feed through the moving current. So the barnacle benefits from having food. The whale, however, does not get any benefit from this relationship, but it's not harmed either for that barnacle being there. Another example could be a bird building a nest in a tree. The bird benefits because it has a place to live. The tree, however, does not benefit, but it's not harmed either. So that's commensalism. And then parasitism, which is probably the easiest, is like a mosquito on a dog. The mosquito will bite a dog and suck its blood, so it gets food, so it's positive, where the dog is actually harmed by this interaction, and so that would be the host. When we're talking about parasitism, the one that always benefits will be the parasite. The one that's always harmed will be a host. Another example could be like a tapeworm in a human. Tapeworms will attach its head into the lining of our small intestines, and it will start to absorb all of our food and nutrients from us. So the tapeworm gets a free place to live and free food. The bad thing is it's taking our food from us, so it does harm us. And so that is parasitism. Okay, so the definition of mutualism, both benefit, like a human gut flora, which means that we have bacteria that lives inside of our digestive system, which helps to break down our food. Bacteria gets a place to live in free food. We get our food helped breaking down. Cattle and the cowbird, bees and pollinating flowers are all examples. And you only have to pick 2 of any of the ones that I say. Commensalism is where one benefits and the other is harmed. So like Spanish moss or ball moss that grow on a tree, the remora and shark, or the mimicry of a butterfly to a monarch. Okay. And the last one, parasitism, where one benefits and the other is harmed. Parasites, such as fleas on dogs, a zombie snail with a flatworm, and this is really cool. Let me show you this video.
Under this layer of vegetation, a shade-loving snail has been invaded by worms. These parasites take over the snail's brain and push into his tentacles, transforming them into swollen, colorful, pulsating targets. At dawn, the snail leaves the protection of the vegetation, climbing toward danger. Out in the open, in the hot and dry sun, the snail is exposed and vulnerable. The pulsating tentacles mimic a maggot, the perfect meal for the parasite's next host. A bird. The snail will likely survive this attack, but more parasites are growing inside its body and will move into its regenerated tentacles. The worms are ingested by the bird and begin to reproduce. The bird spreads thousands of parasite eggs throughout the forest to infect more snails.
Okay, so that kind of shows you another example. This one is really gross, and there's a picture of that on the wall outside talking about how this one little fish will actually go inside a larger fish and it will eat its tongue and use its body to replace the tongue. And so as the fish is eating, that tiny little crustacean will take all of its food. So that definitely harms the host. And there we are. The spotted rose snapper. Notice how it puts its body in the place of the tongue and then will eat the fish from the food. So here's another video.
Here we have the fish tongue, which has been cut from this fish's mouth. If you'll examine the inside of the mouth, you will see that much like that lady that was in Titus Andronicus in Shakespeare's play, she has had her tongue cut out, and this is the tongue. And it may look like an ordinary fish tongue. It's segmented, looks almost like a beetle, but if you look closely, it has little feet that move around, and the tongue looks like it's walking. And the first time that we saw this, we were really freaked out. I'm going to put this on YouTube because I feel that everyone in the world should see this. It's such a weird phenomenon, and yet it's often not talked about. Okay, I'm going to do a horrible thing and impale it to make it spasm out a little. Oh, and I forgot the best part about it is that it has what looks like, well, the last one did, but it looks like it has eggs in the side of it sometimes.
Okay, so I just wanted you to see a couple of those videos of the parasites because we are going to go into parasitism a lot more detailed. Okay, so let's talk about the last one, which is predation. Predation is pretty much the relationship between a predator and its prey. Predation is when one animal eats another animal, and this is something that we see all the time. Okay, so if you were to have an alligator eat another fish, the alligator would be the predator, the one that is doing the eating. The prey is always the one that is being eaten. So how do prey prevent from being eaten? Well, they have to have adaptations. Do they have speed to allow them escape, or does the predator have speed to be able to chase them? Do they have claws to help catch their animals? Do they have armors to help defend themselves? Do they hide by having camo or mimicry, by looking like something else that is dangerous or poisonous? All of these relationships between one animal eating another is predation. So how do populations change in a short or long run? Short-term change is when many smalls go up and down. So pretty much you might have the population of the moose rise, fall, rise, fall. That is short-term relationship, kind of like in the picture that I've shown below. You have a moose and you have a pack of wolves. Notice how one population goes up, then the other population is going to decline. If this population declines, then the moose population is going to go up. Over long-term predation, you're pretty much going to see an overall stability. When an ecosystem is in a state of equilibrium, pretty much meaning that it's stable, all the species can coexist in their niche without dramatic changes in the population over time. So in our PBL, you have all been assigned a keystone species. It is very important. The reason why it's called a keystone is because that species helps that ecosystem to maintain equilibrium. So what we're going to see throughout this PBL is what is going to happen to your ecosystem if your organism or your species was to decline or increase. What would be the effects of that? So there's that picture bigger. So what kind of adaptations do you think would help the moose to survive, or what about the wolf? Obviously, the wolf probably has speed, teeth, claws, and most importantly, they hunt in packs. That is a behavioral adaptation instead of a structural adaptation. The moose, they live in herds. They have antlers for defense, and they have nostrils that are very close together so that they can run and actually go into the water to avoid the wolf from coming after them. So that's the notes. You need to make sure that you have everything written down. If you missed a section, just pause it, rewind, and then once you're done with this, ask Miss Lack for a vocabulary sheet so you can start filling that out. And I'll see you Friday.